What do you think defines a hippie? Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines a hippie as a usually young person who rejects the mores of established society and advocates for a nonviolent ethic. Hippie movements have historical impacts on social movements throughout American history. Hippie movements are counterculture movements that were popularized in the 1960s but have roots dating back all the way to the early 1800s. Their influences on everyday life are very apparent throughout society, and I will explain to you throughout this speech what all they have accomplished through underground grassroots movements. The first wave of hippies came in the early 1800s, and they established utopian societies like Brook Farm in the early 1830s and 1820s, and they came to call themselves the Transcendentalists. They were the first hippie big idea, really. They believed in the beauty of nature and God and of oneself. They believe in peace with the universe and as it reflects good nature, and writers like Ralph Waldo Emerson discuss this idea in his most renowned work, Nature. As he writes in 1836, "In the tranquil landscape, and especially in the distant line of the horizon, man beholds somewhat as beautiful as nature of his own." Transcendentalists' strong belief in individuality and civil rights led them to be on the forefronts of the abolitionist movement and women's rights movements. Transcendentalist leader Theodore Parker was a close friend of John Brown, who was a radical abolitionist in the 1840s, who was arrested for breaking into a federal armory and was eventually killed because of all that he had done. He was considered a terrorist at the time for his movements against slavery. The Gilder Lehrman Institute writer of Philip F. Gora writes in his Transcendentalism and Social Reform article from 2009, "In another arena, Margaret Fuller, who was one of the first women's rights activists at the time, influenced by Ralph Waldo Emerson's doctrine of self-reliance, became the foremost advocate of women's rights in her day." And so this just goes to show how much the hippies had an influence on the 1800s movements such as abolitionism and women's rights, that by the early 1900s, women had the right to vote and slavery was abolished by the 1860s. The second wave of hippies came in the mid-1960s with the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement in full swing. Stereotypically shown with long hair and peace signs and beards, these hippies were much different than their early predecessors of the 1800s. Groups like the War Resisters League and the Students for a Democratic Society, or the SDS, protested the Vietnam conflict against the war in the 1860s. Tom Hayden was known for his activism against the war, and he eventually became a state senator for California. Encyclopedia Britannica writes, Scott Schaefer, he completed an article about Hayden on September 15th of 2017. After leaving the legislature, he worked on protest campaigns against the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that goes to show about how much pacifism became popularized ever since the 1960s, how 40 years later the same people are advocating for the same thing, and that's that people in the 1960s didn't want the Vietnam War to continue, and by the early 2000s these same people were advocating for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan to end. And many of the songwriters in the 1960s, such as Bob Dylan and John Fogerty, wrote about wartime aggressions in their songs Blowin' in the Wind and Fortunate Son, respectively. Several performers in the 1960s, including Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, the band, the Grateful Dead, and The Who, performed at Woodstock. It was a 1969 music festival and arts festival that included several of the popularized people at the time who came together around one movement, and that was pretty much the anti-war movement. And Woodstock.com summarizes the event in their homepage. It was 4 days of music, 500,000 people, rain, and the rest is history. The festival took place in a dairy farm in upstate New York, and 400,000 to 500,000 people estimated gathered around the same farm in upstate New York and just had a good time, dancing in the mud, and it became one of the biggest music events and historical events of American history. And it was at the same period in hippie history that drugs such as LSD and marijuana became popularized, but even because of this, they had a lot of similarity to the Transcendentalists of the 1800s in ideology. W.J. Rohrabaugh contributes to the George Washington University History article, News Network, through Hippies Won the Culture War article from September 27th of 2015. At the heart, the counterculture was about three things: a search for authenticity, an insistence upon individualism, and a desire for community. This era popularized blue jeans, beards, organic food, and legal marijuana. As we see, these are still things that are all on the news today, where we have Whole Foods and we have people protesting for legal marijuana in states like California and Oregon where it's already been legalized. And hippies still exist today, and they adopt the same ideals as the group before them, they just dress a little bit differently. Hippie movements are not entirely bad for society, as they're always willing to step forward in individualism and say the things no one else wants to say. As time goes on, people in 20 years will be able to identify the effects that this era's hippie movement has had for the next generation. Hippies have been around for a while, and they influence society through music, literature, and political involvements. And their marks are really permanent on society, and it's very evident of everything that they have improved and everything that they have changed throughout society when it comes to women's rights and abolitionism, and then we have drug rights and even things that go as far as just clothing in general, how we have tie-dye so popularized in modern day. But it's very evident to everything that hippies have done in modern day and everything that they have changed throughout history. And all of their effects will be seen throughout for the next generation and the generation after.